In the early 1960s, Catholic bishops from around the world held a meeting to discuss the issues facing the Church, ultimately producing landmark documents of reform. This meeting was the Second Vatican Council. A source of controversy in recent years, some wishing to undo its teachings while others hoping to push them further, the majority of Catholics today are left in the middle with a slightly more fundamental question. What was Vatican II again? This is Catholicism in Focus. From the civil rights movement to anti-war protests, the sexual revolution and the challenging of traditional gender roles, and the rapid advance of worldwide pop culture and information technology, the 1960s were a time of radical change around the world. At the same time, the Catholic Church was undergoing its largest reform in 400 years. Over the course of the decade, the Mass went from Latin to English, lay people were distributing communion, meat was being eaten on Fridays, religious were no longer wearing habits, Catholics were collaborating with Protestants, and more than a few peculiar scenes began to spring up.
His methods are unorthodox, but Father Alvarez in North Mexico has decided to give his parishioners what they want: religion mixed with entertainment.
And even though some of these things had nothing to do with the council or even against the council's teaching, seriously, a lot of people misinterpreted the council and did some weird things. Many people, not knowing the theological foundation, simply lumped these reforms together with the radical revolutions of the time and dismissed Vatican II as a liberal council. And depending on your perspective, that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's not necessarily an accurate thing. At the heart of the bishop's agenda were two principles. The first was expressed in the Italian word aggiornamento, or bringing up to date. The church was living in a world that was vastly different from previous eras, and the bishops set as their goal to bring the ancient and unchanging faith and tradition of the church into the modern world so as to renew the church's mission. Pope St. John XXIII, the pope that convened the council, hoped and prayed for what he called a new Pentecost. This meant first and foremost an updating of the church's relationship with the outside world. Particularly in the 100 years from Vatican I to Vatican II, Catholics had maintained a defensive, insular-minded worldview, wanting to protect the church and its faith from the dangers of the outside world. A new approach was represented all throughout the council, in the discussion of who was included in the people of God in Lumen Gentium, in the recognition that the Spirit blows everywhere and knocks the door of every human heart in Gaudium et Spes, and in promoting positive relationships with other religions in Nostra Aetate. This new approach did not come out of nowhere, but was based on the second principle, captured this time in the French word ressourcement, or a call to go back to the original sources. Today, we take for granted what we know about history. Because of years of research and discovery, we can look back thousands of years and have a fairly good idea of what happened. This was not the case at previous councils. Even between just the First and Second Vatican Councils, less than 100 years apart, the Church had rediscovered ancient documents that had been lost for more than 1,700 years, opening a window into the long-forgotten or misunderstood early Church. In studying these newly rediscovered resources, many theologians and church leaders found a disconnect between the ancient Church and the modern Church. Something had been lost or distorted over time. What's also important to remember is that this process and its subsequent reforms did not come solely from the council, but was really the culmination of many years of renewal bubbling up from the bottom within the church. As early as 70 years before, theologians and lay people alike were rediscovering aspects of our faith and putting them into action. Almost all of the foundational ideas of the council were anticipated in the work and writings of people like Henri de Lubac, Lambert Baudouin, Yves Congar, and Karl Rahner, all theologians that lived and published well before the 1960s. Together, the reforms of aggiornamento and ressourcement presented a church to the outside world that looked radically different than just a decade earlier. And for some, this seemed like a betrayal of the church's tradition. Some practice that had lasted for centuries disappeared, and some customs that offered uniform identity were suppressed. Many, even within the church, believed that the ancient history of the church was being thrown away. But contrary to the popular belief that Vatican II was just a liberal reaction to a changing world, history shows us quite the opposite. At the heart of Vatican II was nothing more than a deep desire to recapture the essential tradition of the church. Sure, 1, 2, 400-year-old traditions were removed, but some 1,500, even 2,000-year-old traditions were restored. The trouble sometimes is that we confuse the unchanging, dogmatic tradition of the church with the individual traditional expressions that make it known. What makes us Catholic is not the way we eat, the specific mechanics of prayer, or our individual daily practices. It's our call to be followers of Jesus Christ, engaging the world in a sacramental way, living in real communion with one another, and knowing that God is truly present among us. This cannot be contained in any individual expression of the day, and we, as a living and growing community, must always be free to update and adapt when previous expressions, no matter how old, no longer enable us to do so. Vatican II, studying the past and looking to the future, did just that. Thanks for watching this episode of Catholicism in Focus. This week, I want to especially thank Terry Lulius for being awesome and supporting this mission. You too can be awesome like Terry and donate to the cause, either with a monthly donation through Patreon or a one-time gift on PayPal, or simply by sharing this video with your friends.